I had never heard of Live Alive before the remake was announced, and I imagine many of you haven't either. After all, it was previously a Japan exclusive RPG for the Super Famicom, and it sold a mere 270,000 copies. Regardless, I was excited about the remake, primarily because it used the HD 2D art style that is oh so beautiful. But was it worth the effort to remake, or should it have stayed an unreleased relic? Well, that's what I'm here to answer in GameXplain's review of Live Alive on the Nintendo Switch. To catch everyone up, Live Alive is a unique JRPG chronicling the tales of 8 characters across different eras, each offering variations in gameplay and narrative. And to say the game is one of a kind would be an understatement. It's unlike any other classic JRPG I have played, and Live Alive dared to step out of the boundaries, and unfortunately, it wasn't rewarded for its efforts at the time. Each chapter is unique in some way, and you can freely jump in and out of them at any time whenever you want. Take the Twilight of Edo Japan. This feels almost like a traditional JRPG with no real gimmicks to speak of. It gives you an expansive level to explore and some stealth mechanics so you can avoid battling. The Distant Future chapter has virtually zero combat to speak of, instead it's a murder mystery set on a small spaceship. The most unique one though is the present day, a JRPG take on Street Fighter. It's a short chapter, but you must fight champions from all around the world who wear their inspiration on their sleeve, being remixed versions of Street Fighter characters. Here, you don't level up traditionally, instead you must bait out the attacks of your opponents to learn their moves and become stronger. The list goes on, but as I write this, I can think of at least one way every chapter stood out. While they are distinct, there are plenty of issues with the game's structure. The chapters are short, maybe 2 to 4 hours, and it feels shorter than I would expect from a JRPG of the era. And as a result, all of the characters feel pretty shallow, as they don't have time to develop. There were some exciting narrative strings at points, but ultimately they fell flat when I only spent a few hours with them. With 9 chapters, I expected the game to be a bit longer than it was, but I finished it in 27 hours. I'm not looking for each chapter to take 10 or 15 hours, but I felt like each character could have used another 2 or 3 hours for me to grow fully attached to them. Game narratives have come a long way since this was initially released, and I'm sad to say I couldn't care less about most of these characters. Thankfully, it's not all bad from a narrative standpoint, as the dialogue is generally written well, and the game is genuinely funny. Much of it is toilet humour, but I have the brain of a 5-year-old boy, so I chuckled every single time there was a fart joke. Gameplay is a bit of a mixed bag, partially because every chapter has something different to offer, such as in the Wild West where you have a time limit to prepare a small town for battle against raiding bandits. At first I thought this mechanic was so cool, but it boiled down to finding items and giving them to the random people in the village to set traps, and I didn't feel any time pressure doing this, so it was quite uneventful. The near future has a mind reading mechanic that led to the funniest encounter in the game, but just like the narrative, the mechanics are either not fleshed out enough or aren't given enough time to flourish. Take the prehistoric chapter for example, which has a crafting system. As you kill enemies, you gain materials to make improved weapons and armour, but it's barely functional. I only had to use it a handful of times and never felt compelled to do it otherwise. Unfortunately, this extends to combat also. There is nothing wrong with the combat itself. When it works, it's probably the most engaging combat system of any classic JRPG I have ever played. But for the majority of the game, it's as wide as an ocean but deep as a puddle. It's done off a grid system which adds a bit of complexity to the combat, but in most cases, battles can be completed with just 1 or 2 attacks. While each character can learn a ton of moves, I usually ended up using just 3 moves or so that could handle most enemies with no issue. The boss fights too are nothing to write home about. I had no problems beating most of them, and I was hoping for a bit of a challenge. Now, the combat is at its best during the final 2 chapters, and the placement of your party members is crucial to beat the battles, and building a diverse team that can deal with the enemy's strengths and weaknesses showed me just how engaging the combat system can be. But for the rest of the game, it just isn't implemented this well. The game is somewhat disjointed. No mechanic or narrative point is given enough time to come into its own entirely, and as a result, I would say prepare yourself to play these as a handful of short stories, rather than one coherent experience. There is one thread that links all the stories together which I won't spoil, and it all culminates in the final 2 chapters. Now don't worry, I'm going to keep this part spoiler free, and only show early gameplay from the final 2 chapters. But here is where the game really captivated me. The penultimate chapter really sinked its teeth into me. Although it tells a cliched story of a knight who has to save a kidnapped princess, nostalgic presentation helped elevate it into something that I loved. Plus, the combat here is actually challenging. While the basic enemies are still easy to dispatch, the boss fights are significantly more difficult and engaging than anything the game previously offered, and it only gets better from there. The final chapter is where the entire narrative finally comes together. Again, no spoilers, but this chapter made me do a complete 180 on how I felt about this game. This is hands down one of my favourite parts of any JRPG ever. You start with one of the 7 characters of your choosing, and you can find the rest of them throughout the map and recruit them to your party. I explored every last inch of the map looking to build the strongest party I could, ensuring I had a healer, a hard-hitting physical attacker, and a sharp-shooting ranged character. And to make it all better, the map is littered with character-specific dungeons that house valuable items and the character's ultimate weapon. Again, I'm not going to spoil anything, not even visually, but I had an absolute blast in this chapter. It shows how good this combat system can be when given the proper care. As I said, the placement of my party was vital to my success, and even the basic enemies took a bit of brain to fight. On top of this, the bosses in the dungeons and the final boss were exhilarating. It took me quite some time to figure out the best strategy for the final boss, and even though I was frustrated at the difficulty, the rush from beating him was fantastic. It's a shame that this chapter can be so strong and the others have so many issues. If the combat was engaging throughout the story, I could forgive the relatively shallow characters. Even the narrative and how the game wraps everything up are way better than anything in the previous chapter. Now, I can say that the presentation is absolutely phenomenal. I want Square Enix to remake their whole classic catalogue in this art style because I love it so much. The sprites are beautifully detailed with so much care poured into even the smallest and most insignificant enemies and foliage. The character animations are amazing too. There's something about how little bits of their hair and clothes move that just brings them to life. And it would be a shame if I didn't mention the attack animations. Some are basic slashes that have a nice bit of feedback, but others are massive screen-shattering moves that send a fiery phoenix across the screen, or a load of wonderfully animated butterflies, and I couldn't wait to see what each new chapter brought to the table. Regardless of how I felt about the gameplay, the game is not only a visual feast but an audio one too, as the music is masterful. I can hear the main theme playing as I write the script, and there are so many standout tracks that I don't even know where to begin. There simply isn't a bad piece of music in the game, so instead of gushing for 25 minutes about it, I'll show you snippets of my 3 favourite tracks, and do note, filtering it down to 3 was a near impossible task. Square were onto something with this HD 2D art style in Octopath Traveler, and it's used to an even better effect here, and I can't wait to see what else is to come with Dragon Quest III and future projects. Overall, I'm quite torn on Live Alive. The lack of depth is a major problem, as each chapter feels too short and shallow. The unique mechanics aren't given enough time for them to matter, and ultimately wind up feeling more like gimmicks. Now don't get me wrong, I still had fun, and there's a nice variety of locations, stories and characters, and it all looks beautiful. But I was just hoping for something a little bit more. If it weren't for the final 2 chapters, I would be mixed on Live Alive. However, these 2 chapters were so strong that I can go as far to say that I liked Live Alive. There we have a review for Live Alive. Are you going to get it? And if so, who are you going to pick first? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to check out the videos on the right, and you may as well subscribe while you're at it. I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you all on the next video.